industry, money transmitters in particular, have been wholly unable to get themselves organized over the last 10 or 12 years and in turn been just basically ineffective in Washington. There are, again, little pools of people that have been, but as a group together, and we have seen the results in the inability to have any substantial impact on policy in Washington, to the point that we are still, 12 years later from the first of the witch hunts, really, in the MSB industry. You have the head of FinCEN this past week saying to the banks, please be more gentle on the MSBs. But that's all that can happen is a statement like that. The second is looking at the prepaid space, and the setting up of the Network Branded Prepaid Card Association came at a very timely point. They've worked, much like Ed said, on the creation of some self-governance and becoming a focal point that people can look to within the industry from Capitol Hill, from the regulatory agencies, for guidance on what is happening with the industry. So two separate case studies that are definitely worth taking a look at.
Excellent.
I've got one more example. The insurance industry has the National Association of Insurance Commissioners, and the members of that organization are the appointed or elected insurance commissioner of every state, but the association itself has something like 500 employees. And their job is to make sure that, if State Farm has an insurance product, that they're essentially able to sell it and, provide it the same way in all 50 states without having to comply with 50 different regimes, right? So we need something like that. That would be nice. I think we're far off from that. I think it's too early to have something like that. But I hope we get to something like that. From an entrepreneur's perspective, you guys have to innovate as fast as you can. Don't stop, keep going. Regulation is reactionary, and it will react to the mistakes that you guys make, but you need to make them so our rules are good rules and not predictive rules that don't hit the nail on the head.
I was just briefly going to say, I think, Carol's example with the prepaid cards, one thing you saw there, though, was you saw the group, and obviously coming from a lot of different backgrounds, but their goal was to get it established so that they then could profit and move forward, and that happened. But they were able to do that because they had something that I don't think the Bitcoin community totally has right now, and that was some solidarity on a number of major issues. I think there's still a lot of, particularly since one, it's international, and so it's a lot of things outside the United States, but two, just generally speaking, like your regulation question, things like that, the voices of the Bitcoin world are so varied right now. It's hard to have the 5 strengths that they really can move forward with. I think the more that people sort of can give a little on things, the more that there would be a group consensus on at least some things that everybody or almost everybody can agree to that need to get to Washington, that need to be protected. And really have a strong position that way. Right now, just if you read, people of all various opinions, it just goes too many different directions.
Yeah, just real quick, from an entrepreneur, small business, the worst thing you can do is just do nothing. Operating a business in the United States, whether you're an individual or a small business, we're used to, we live in a world where we get income or we get statements sent to us annually. Has a number on it, we report it, it's very simple. In the Bitcoin world, that's just not, that doesn't happen. We don't know, no one's sending us, how much income we got in Bitcoin, so what you have to do is make a best effort and run like a business, have a set of books, and because the IRS comes, or anybody, any regulators, state regulators, sales tax, anything, you have to have made a best effort to report, to follow the rules, and run like a true business.
All right, very good. So I know that we're right before lunch. Oh yes, we're going to get there. So I know we're at lunch, and if the panel will, we got to take a few more questions. Okay, we'll take. And I know we're going to go for lunch, and I think you've got the mic, so you're next.
So I am a little bit amused that the 5 of you sitting up there, for all intents and purposes, could have your jobs made redundant by the blockchain, really, and Bitcoin. So you mentioned the millennials, and I think, Carol, you and I have kids who are in that age demographic, and they're really my target for Bitcoin adoption for the purpose of disruption. So all of you have pretty much sat up there and said that regulation is a foregone conclusion. I'm not, I tend to be pretty idealistic, but I'm not convinced by that. So I guess it's David, right? I think I'd like to hear from you in how, what that bridge is maybe between the millennials who really have the opportunity to dump it all, just to completely walk away from the system that has been for the last 100 years, both the banking system and the state, which I'm in favor of eradicating the state altogether. So, so in terms of regulation, this gentleman asked, you know, what should the community do, which I think is a ridiculous question. Regulate yourself, you know. But in terms of like the Silk Road and everything, yeah, we'll hear a lawyer. You know, Silk Road, I was really surprised that when the government confiscated those coins and they were sold, when there hasn't even been a, when Ross has been charged, but there hasn't been a guilty verdict determined and everything. So between those people who are saying regulation is a foregone conclusion and those who are on the side of, no, we don't want any regulation whatsoever, you've already said, Carol, that the regulators can't keep up. So, and you're saying innovate as fast as you can. So, and then you're saying down here that, well, yeah, go ahead and do all of that, but just stay in compliance. So there seems to be like several different, you know, messages being said, and, you know, then there's me saying, ignore them all, and just keep I think you're all really nice.
If I can jump in, I've ended up in a situation over the last several years of Beal, and I think you've had the same, where we're dealing with people who have gotten caught in the crosshairs of that undefined space. And the best example, and still, you know, the key example in the digital currency world is the e-gold case. E-gold was a digital currency that was founded in 1995. It was the only one of several that emerged in the 90s to survive into the 2000s, and in 2007 it was taken down by the US government. The founders of the company were also prosecuted individually, and at the end of the day, after they ended up signing plea agreements, the judge said, I don't believe you have illegal intent, and I don't believe your system is illegal. But what you did is the criminals got into it early and abused it, and you didn't take the steps to put controls around it to prevent that criminal abuse. The thing is we have criminal statutes that say it's illegal to be involved in the facilitation of money laundering. Helping people money laundering. It's not just doing it yourself, but aiding and abetting in it and being willfully blind to it. So if you use that as the basis, but these are two people, these are three people who have had their lives irreversibly changed. And the reason I got into Bitcoin originally a year and a half or almost 2 years ago is because I could see the same things happening in the Bitcoin community the same way people were talking as to the kind of conversations that were being had in the early 2000s about the lack of regulation, the lack of laws in this area, but their lives were ruined. And I've been trying to help people not have their lives ruined, to understand what it is, the world we do live in, and how you need to play within that world. Now, is it a perfect world from a regulatory perspective? I think that's one of the things that's so exciting about this, to a certain extent, experiment that we have going on right now, is we have an opportunity to shape these laws, but we've got to do it, and we can't just say, do away with that 100 years or so, 200 years of experience that we do have, but how can we work within that and move forward?
I think you're just going to continue to see, you know, as it stands now, even though we have some that the lack of a lot of the looseness of where the regulatory things stand, and Silk Road's a perfect example. You know, one way or another, they were, once, you know, they became aware of it and started investigating, and since then we've seen there's so many different investigations that are going on and continue to go on. There's probably undercover officers probably here today. And the reason for that is they're gonna be aggressive about it for a lot of different things. But what sort of Carol's hitting on is the responsibility of the people involved in it. You know, just from the standpoint of the laundering issue, you know, you see that's something I think that will continue to be on the rise and the uptake of that type of thing, similar to looking at, you know, if a bank, a normal bank, if they're taking in, you know, large amounts of cash and they're not reporting it, then they're going to be held responsible for that, even though they may not be involved in whatever the alleged illegal activity that the cash is coming from. They've then connected themselves to it. So there's a degree of protection for the people that, as she said in the Eagle case, that, you know, are not purposely trying to be involved in any type of criminal activity, but due to, you know, even without the lack of the actual intent to do it, they ultimately get involved in it. And, you know, and as far as the money with Silk Road, you know, even though Ross has not been convicted, the way that it works from a seizure standpoint is it's a civil claim, it's a civil seizure. So, you know, the laws are different and the standby different. So they're able to seize it, and he may walk away completely, you know, not guilty on all charges, but civilly they can still come after your property and your assets. Because if you're not, just like when it comes down to the IRS side, if you're not showing where that money's coming from and how you got it, then they're going to determine that you got it a way that you shouldn't have, and they're going to go for it. And that's just the reality of it.
Next question. Go ahead.
Yeah, those coins that were sold were actually, were only super servers for the users.
Right.
They weren't DVRs coins, so I think they had a period where they could come in and claim them, but they were illegal.
That was my case. You know, obviously my guy he could come try to claim those coins and say, you know, I want those back. What I was doing was not illegal, but you're incriminating yourself by walking into it, if they really are yours.
I was going to say, yeah, I don't think most people are going to raise their hand there.
Anyway, that wasn't my question. You guys are from South Carolina, and I'm from North Carolina, and my dad did a lot of business in North and South Carolina, and he preferred South Carolina because they're always business friendly with their legislation and regulation things that they do. So are you guys have no money transmitter laws now in South Carolina? So finally, they start up for a young Bitcoin cryptocurrency entrepreneur. I'm looking at South Carolina as a place to do business. Do you guys foresee any of this get license nonsense in South Carolina?
Not anytime soon. From a legislative standpoint, for just the simple reason that there's so many things they concentrate on. The way the legislature's set up in a short period of time, we only have part-time legislation and legislators. There's a lot more things on the schedule, particularly for the people. You know, if they saw things related to Bitcoin regulation coming up, as opposed to, you know, funding bills for education and things like that, you'd probably see a lot of politicians lose their seats. So I wouldn't see it anytime soon.
And they're probably the first concentrate on nexus issues, sales tax, things of that nature.
But an important thing to keep in mind is if you can do business in South Carolina, but if you do business with people in other states, you have to be concerned about the laws of the other states. So, and with just a handful of exceptions, the other states take the position that if you do business with residents in those states, you have to have licenses in those states, or you have to comply with their money transmission licenses.
So no New Yorkers. I wouldn't sign them.
That's the big issue there.
You always have the feds above that too, so unfortunately you can't just go have the autonomy of that state per se, even if it was internal within the state you're doing it, because obviously the federal, if there were guidelines, would have to be followed as well.
Excuse me for interrupting, guys, but my question kind of is more of a broad question than the specifics as to particular regulations that people have in mind or the ideas people have. But as a software engineer and as a programmer, somebody who's actually studied Bitcoin for over a year now, from the protocol to the source code that has to go into mining pools, how do any of these regulations plan to be imposed or governed, or how do you plan on enforcing these regulations when there are no programmers at the lobbyist boards, or even there are no programmers behind this documentation being handed in?
I'm going to, before we take it to the panel, I mean, it's funny because I've gotten that question actually quite a few times. How do you enforce that? Well, the government may not be able to enforce the software, but they can enforce rules on you. So what you do with it, they can regulate.
How would you then know? I mean,
I'm going to bet that there's maybe no one in this room that could actually take the address that I give and drag it to a wall and identify me to be a sole owner of that address. So I'm guessing, I understand you guys, the people behind this documentation, these regulations, feel confident in their knowledge and abilities, and I don't want to discredit their experience because what they've done for the country is invaluable. But it's the problem of the source code, and until it's changed, you can't stop them from using it the way it's.
Yeah, and you're right, and I think one way to look at it, and that's the beautiful thing of the protocol, you know, it's decentralized, they cannot get their hands on it in a sense. But we live in a self-reporting system in my world, you know, I mean, that's, you know, we live in a self-reporting income system, tax, things like that, so it's more of not, you know, the IRS, you know, I use IRS as an example, obviously, but they pretty much know what you make, 95% of what you make before you report it. The challenge they're going to have with this is how can they get data from blockchain or these transactions? That's a major problem. But like I said, we live in a self-reporting system. So
we have selective prosecution. There's no question about that. So it's a lot like driving down a road. You can have 100 cars speeding, going above the speed limit, and there's one car that's going to get pulled over. And the question is, why did that one car get pulled over? Well, in this world, what happens is the car that usually gets pulled over because there's been some criminal activity that's been going on. And it's the actual criminal activity itself that leads the investigators to see where the funding has come for that criminal activity. And as they start to go back and look and see what follow the money, follow the finance trail, that's what leads them to, you know, who's behind it. And then they start to look at the players and, you know, what their role in facilitating that activity is. So go back to the Eagle case. I mean, that's a case that should be studied intently by this community to understand that it was criminal, it was Eagle popping up again and again and again in criminal activity, cyber crimes. And that as the government started putting the pieces together and they track back and they find out what the company is, and then you have a young company, inexperienced in dealing with government affairs and so on, that doesn't know how to respond appropriately to it. So we bring back a whole bunch of issues we've been talking about here, but it goes exactly to what your point is that, being aware of the universe that you're in, what your role is and how something could possibly go wrong in what you're doing and how that could ultimately come back to you. And then figuring out how you can protect yourself around that. And that's where some organization is helpful, as well as there are some steps that you can take that you can help yourself. And I could give you, offline some examples of that.
One more question.
Okay, so I got to think when he asked about the mining and whatnot, and really the function of the miners is not so much to validate the transactions, but put them into the blockchain, and then the nodes are actually broadcasting them all over. So if I'm running a full node, there's really no way for me to know that the transaction that I'm rebroadcasting that's hit the network is illegal, or where it comes from, for that matter. So how would they ever be able to hold somebody accountable for rebroadcasting a transaction that maybe comes from somebody that's doing an illegal activity, fundamentally?
How many of you are on tour? Okay, so you're a node on tour, right? Well, best case to your question is the gentleman in Germany one morning at 4 a.m. was awakened by pounding on the door, and it was the German police walking in to arrest him because he was involved in child pornography. And he says, "What do you mean? I don't do that." And they said, "It's all on your computer." And they went in and showed him how he was on the Tor network and how this whole child pornography ring was being run through his computer. So that's the way things can come back. It's just an example of it. And so what do? Say, okay, I'm going to take the chance that I'm being used in that kind of way. So it's risk. It's definitely risk taking on your part. I mean, you have to make a risk analysis there.
Right.
If I'm running a node, I'm not really choosing what transactions I can accept and I can reject, nor do I know really the source of where they're coming from. I'm just rebroadcasting to the network what is already flowing to the network.
Right. and you may not have criminal intent, but I was saying, hasn't there been some cases with like BitTorrent? There's been some people that have got arrested for providing licensed content that was, you know, in other words, I think there's been some cases in redistribution, like I said, I know the Germany one, and I think there's been some other ones with some other software that was being, you're not intending to do that, but if your node is being used to rebroadcast, I suppose you're right, there could be legal consequences to that. Again, today I think there's so many of them, I don't think that the regulation is anywhere near that deep yet, they're not looking at that, but to your point, as they become more centralized, that would be very possible.
So is every other node in the network, so is every microphone, because
right.
But if everybody in the Bitcoin network is not responsible for facilitating that consumption.
That's correct. And what would probably happen is somebody would probably, if somebody was using your node to rebroadcast, and without your knowledge, they just happen to pick your node that they want to send the transactions through, and it could raise a regulatory, like probably an investigation that was going on, and they start researching, they trace it back, via the internet and find a node. And
the ledger is no matter what that transaction should be,
right.
Firm is the blockchain, and that means that every node has a copy of that transaction.
That's correct.
Every node is on the counter.
So this is a case of 100 cars driving down the road and who's going to get pulled over. I mean, you take a risk every time you speed, and you take a risk by being out there. And I'm not saying don't take the risk, but just be aware that there is a risk that's involved.
I really have to say this. There's a type of encryption called zero knowledge proof, which makes it impossible to even see a blockchain, see a node, or see a transaction. It's perfect forward obfuscate anonymity. There's a type of anonymity that there is no transparent blockchain. So that's where it will go, and I think it's a contradiction in terms to say that you want to regulate the ghost.
I love smart people.
Well, don't shoot me as the messenger, please.
From a criminal standpoint, the criminals are always going to be 2 steps ahead of any. I mean, no matter if you're talking about selling marijuana on the street corner, or you're, so with that, I mean, of course that, not too long ago, Silk Road was functioning fine, and they weren't even aware of it. So I mean, yeah, I think you're right to that degree. It's always going to keep moving. And the bottom line is, no matter what it is, if people want to act and transact in illegal ways, they're going to find a way to do it. Maybe they're risking a lot, maybe they're not, depending on how much security they may feel that they have. But that will always continue.
What happens when they decentralize the media and your voices don't get heard? You know what I mean? That's the problem. The decentralization, it's a movement. And if government wants to do something about it, the scary part is, what I don't think a lot of Bitcoiners realize is Bitcoin's going to end up being turned on its head, where it's not going to be used to obfuscate identity, it's going to be used to prove it.
Right.
I think you're right.
Yeah, I think you're very,
absolutely.
All right, everybody, we're like well over, and I know we're into lunch, so thank you very much, and thank you, panelists.